everyone. Just like last week, I'm Rachel. I'm here to continue our five-part lesson series about food, where food comes from, and what food does for our bodies. So last week we spent some time talking about our friend the pollinator and what pollinators do for our environment, right? We know that all of our fruits come from flowers. We learned that in our sixth plant part lesson, which makes flowers super important for growing our food, which is why we need our friends, the pollinators, like bees, hummingbirds, bats, and butterflies, in order to help us turn those flowers into fruits. So today we're actually continuing our conversation about animals, invertebrates, and insects that help us make our food, right? And we know that a big part of that is soil. So we're basically going to be talking about our friends, the decomposers, today. So a decomposer is basically any organism, once again, an animal, invertebrate, bacteria, fungi, anything like that, that is basically going to help aid in the decomposition or decay of organic material. And you might be thinking, well, that doesn't really explain a whole lot. What is organic material? What are some examples of a decomposer? And don't worry, we're going to walk you through it. So, organic matter can be alive, like we're talking about things like roots, different types of underground fungi that are growing, and bacterias. Some things that are dead could be leftover plants that have died, animals that have died or passed away, those kind of things. And then of course, the very dead, which is basically our soil, our humus, which is our stabilized organic matter that really can't be broken down any further. Some examples of our friends, the decomposers, are listed here. As you can see on this infographic, they say they consume and eat dead plants and animals, and then they are actually able to reduce those back down to simpler forms of organic matter or matter that can be basically our soil, right? So some examples of that would be our springtails, which are kind of like really small white bugs. You can kind of see the picture that's in our right-hand corner. You would basically need a magnifying lens in order to see a springtail in that much detail. They're about the size of a pinhead. Then we have our sow bugs, nematodes, which are kind of like earthworms, except they're clear colored. That's kind of how I describe what they look like to my students. We have our ants and fungi, which if you've ever seen a mushroom, you've seen a fungus. Those are our big kind of primary decomposers. That are able to, you might see them growing on trees, you might have eaten them before, and that's all great. They're amazing at taking that dead material and kind of breaking it down. Another example of an insect might be a mite or a centipede or a beetle. Those are all amazing decomposers. And then, of course, we have our bacteria, right? There's lots and lots of talk about how bacteria is bad for us. And I want to stress that yes, lots of types of bacteria can be bad for us, not good in our food, not good in our bodies. But there's also bacteria that is good for our bodies and good for our earth, right? So we want to make sure that we are definitely washing our hands and being very diligent in our food prep and our food spaces. But we also want to make sure that we're honoring bacteria as a really important organism that's able to help decompose lots of our organic matter and turn it into that humus or that amazing refined organic matter that can help grow our plants. One of our star decomposers, especially here in the state of Wisconsin, is our worm, right? Worms have been around a very long time, since the Cambrian period. So before dinosaurs, basically when our world was 100% water. And that was probably around 541 million years ago, so quite some time. And you can see that there actually hasn't been a whole lot of changes in 541 million years, which kind of goes to show that worms are pretty great at what they do. In the center of this slide, you can see a diagram of a modern earthworm or an earthworm that you could find in your backyard or in your school garden today. And then if you look to the very right, we have an infographic from the Field Museum in Chicago, and we can see a drawing of an estimated depiction of what a worm might look like in the Cambrian period or in the area of time when the world was basically water. So you can see that the worm really hasn't changed all that much. It's still segmented, which means it's an annelid worm, and basically still a decomposer. Not a whole lot has changed. The other kind of worm that's listed here, a pariapid, a pariapeuplids, priapulids, sorry, they are mostly responsible for eating more carnivorously, but our annelids are the ones that are going to be more of our decomposers, breaking down our more organic matter. And of course, earthworm is a great example of that. And you might start thinking, like, how on earth do decomposers come into this conversation with soil and plants? Well, that's why we want to talk about our nutrient cycle, right? So we learned way back in the 6 plant part lessons that our plants get nutrients from the soil through the roots. But how on earth does that nutrient get into the soil in the first place, right? Basically, that happens through this thing called the nutrient cycle. And we've talked about other cycles before, like maybe the life cycle or the water cycle, or maybe you've heard a word that has the word cycle in it, like a bicycle. And that's basically speaking to the fact that something will go on and on and on and on. It can start at any state and still will continue unless there is an interruption otherwise. So the nutrient cycle here is depicted with our green tree in the center. So our green tree has these brilliant green leaves, and in the fall we know that those leaves are going to turn into kind of a reddish, orangish, yellowish color, and then they're going to fall to the ground. And that's because our tree, like we talked about in our 6 plant part lessons, actually stores lots of its food in the leaves. And when it becomes time for winter, the plant kind of says, oh, I need those foods back, I got to put them in storage, and sucks those foods from the leaves back into the tree and stores them in the roots. So once the tree has kind of done that, it takes the food back, stores it in the roots so it can stay good all throughout the winter, and then use it again in the spring to grow new leaves so it can make more food. Those leaves fall off the tree. They're no longer alive, they're dead. And then those leaves kind of get pushed further down into our soil through things like our water, our snow, and air. And then there are some friends, our decomposers, who really love to nibble on those nutrient-dense leaves. And in this image, we're using our friend the snail as our decomposer. So this cute little snail here is going to go and munch on those dead leaves. And what do all living things do when they're done munching? They poop. So this worm is taking that nutrient-dense leaf, it's eating it, it's pooping it out, and then that's creating nutrient-dense soil, right? So all of our decomposers are kind of doing this, breaking down that organic matter into really nutrient-rich or refined organic matter so that those nutrients, our phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon, can be accessible to our roots. So come springtime, or come anytime, because this process happens all year round, right? That tree can suck up those organic matters and those nutrients through its roots and then make food with the plant. And then of course it goes over and over again because that food is in our leaves, the leaves fall to the ground, you get the picture. So that's one of the reasons why we want to spend some time talking about compost today. So there's lots of ways that we can kind of return this organic matter into our environment, and composting is a really great way to do that. You can do so many different kinds of composting, and if you or your adult that you're with is interested in learning more about composting, we are publishing an additional compost video that's more geared towards adults and how to establish compost bins at home or at your school. But what we did want to highlight is Composting 101, what you can compost and what you can't compost. And of course, these things change depending on where you live. But mostly fruit scraps, vegetable scraps, eggshells, grasses and plants, jams, jellies, paper towels, napkins, dried leaves, cardboard, shredded paper, all of those things are great to add to your compost bin. And then you just turn it a couple times, allow that compost to kind of be marinated within itself and along with all of these other decomposers. That's absolutely amazing at breaking down these composts, and then you'll have organic matter. Sometimes composting isn't necessarily accessible to all of our schools because we have such a massive scale of composting that would need to occur. So I did want to take a second to talk about our food waste. We do know that food waste alone causes at least 10% of our greenhouse gases, or our gases in our natural world that are accumulating and causing climate change. So how this happens is when you go to toss your food in the trash can, are you tossing it into a trash bag? Is that trash bag made of plastic? Can our friends like the worm and the snail and other bugs eat plastic? Probably not, right? So that barrier there creates this inorganic material, our plastic, that can't be eaten by lots of our friends, the decomposers. So basically, that food kind of sits in that plastic bag forever because our plastic can't biodegrade or compost. And then it creates methane. It kind of rots within itself, creates this methane, which is trapped inside this plastic bag, and then that contributes to our food waste. Which brings us back to composting, right? Composting is a really great alternative because it puts those nutrients back in the soil. If we throw our food away and we're not putting it back into our soil, those nutrients are kind of gone. There's nothing else that can return those nutrients to the soil again, which is where lots of people start using inorganic fertilizers. And those fertilizers can be really bad for our environment, especially in areas like Madison, Wisconsin, which has lots of lakes. You may have heard that there are certain times of the year that we can't go swimming in the lakes because of the algae blooms. And that's often because algae is a plant. Well, no, it's not. So it really likes to eat lots of the same things that our plant eats, right? Phosphorus, which is one of our plant foods that you can kind of see here along with our nitrogen and our carbon. So as our algae kind of eats away at those things that are run off from when it rains, moving those nutrients from the plants in our ground to the plants in our water, we end up with lots of algae blooms, lots more carbon emission to put into factoring, to creating those inorganic materials, and we end up with more greenhouse gases. Which brings us back to composting, right? An amazing alternative. I hope that you've enjoyed this lesson. Please feel free to check out our additional materials. We have Taking Care of Your Worms, which is a comprehensive guide to start vermicomposting or composting with worms. We have links in our slides to a compost bin time lapse and a song by the Banana Slug String Band for younger kids, which kind of goes over the process of how our dirt is eating our lunch, right? Because we know that at the end of the day, all of our food comes from plants, which means that all of our food is coming from dirt, making it extremely important to take care of our soils. Thank you so much for listening.